Somewhere in a government building in Washington, D.C., a clerk sat down in December of 1932 and typed a routine administrative list. Papers no longer necessary for current business. The list was sent to the Librarian of Congress for review. Item 22 read, Schedules, Population 1890 Original. The librarian found nothing on the list worth saving. On February 21, 1933, Congress authorized destruction. That was 62,979,766 names. Every name, every address, every occupation, every family structure, every child written into a household, every immigration date, every answer to every question an enumerator had recorded in ink, door to door, across every state in the country during the summer of 1890. It had all been written down. It had all been stored. It had sat, damaged, in a government facility for 12 years, while the question of what to do with it passed through the hands of bureaucrats who had other priorities. Then it became Item 22. Then Congress said yes. Then it was gone. The fire is the part of this story that gets told. The fire is nowhere near the whole story. The 1890 census was not a routine count. At the moment it was taken, it was the most detailed portrait of American life ever assembled. The questions enumerators carried to every door in June of 1890 went further than anything the country had attempted before. Name, age, sex, race, relationship to the head of household, marital status, birthplace, the birthplace of each person's mother and father, occupation, months unemployed in the prior year, whether the person was sick or disabled on the day of enumeration, and with what specific condition, whether they could read, whether they could write, whether they spoke English. Immigration year, whether naturalization papers had been filed, home ownership, whether the home was under a mortgage. This is what was lost. Not just a list of names and ages, a structured record of a life at a specific moment in time. The total enumeration covered 62,979,766 people, approximately 2 million of them were foreign-born. To even process a number that size, the Census Bureau had to use something it had never used before. Herman Hollerith was an engineer who had worked as a Census Bureau statistician after the 1880 count. He had watched the manual tabulation of 50 million records take 8 full years. He had heard the projections that the 1890 census, covering a country that had grown by more than 12 million people in a single decade, might not be fully processed before the next census began. His solution: encode individual responses onto punched cards, then feed those cards through an electrical tabulating machine that could sort and count at speeds no team of human clerks could approach. The government held a competition for the 1890 tabulation contract. Hollerith won. His system processed the count in roughly 2.5 years, faster and cheaper than either competing method. The aggregate results were published as official reports. Summary tables still exist. You can read, in documents available today, how many people lived in each county, how many were foreign-born by country of origin, how many were employed in manufacturing versus agriculture. What Hollerith's machine could not produce was a duplicate of the original schedules. The punch cards were tabulation inputs used to generate totals, not to preserve individuals. The schedules themselves were the handwritten pages a real enumerator had carried house to house. They were the only record of which specific person, at which specific address, had said which specific things. The aggregate survived. The individuals disappeared into it. Hollerith's tabulating company later merged with others, became the Computing Tabulating Recording Company in 1911, and rebranded in 1924 as International Business Machines, IBM. The machine that made the 1890 census computable eventually became the foundation of a corporation that would manage government and corporate data for the rest of the century. The census that built IBM is the census that was destroyed. Before the 1921 fire that most people know about, there was another one that most people don't. On the night of March 22, 1896, a night watchman at Marini's Hall in Washington, D.C., where portions of the 1890 census had been moved for storage, discovered that the rear of the building was on fire. Firefighters arrived to find the basement heavy with smoke. They contained it before sunrise. What burned that night were the 1890 special schedules for mortality, crime, pauperism, benevolence, and special classes. The records documenting the institutionalized, the criminally committed, the blind, the deaf, along with portions of the transportation and insurance schedules. The main population schedules survived the 1896 fire. They were moved to the basement of the U.S. Department of Commerce building in Washington, D.C., placed on wooden pine shelving in an unlocked storage room. 20 inches of clearance between each shelf. The room was full. In the same basement was a fireproof vault. Inside the vault, the 1830 census schedules, the 1840 schedules, the 1880 schedules, the 1900 schedules transferred years after their collection, the 1910 schedules. Every major census that existed in federal storage was inside the vault. The 1890 schedules were not inside the vault. They remained on the pine shelves in an open room that shared the basement with a carpenter's shop and a furnace room. Sawdust on the floor, wood shavings. The ordinary combustible reality of a working building stored in direct proximity to the most irreplaceable population records the country had ever produced. No surviving administrative document explains why the 1890 schedules were left outside the vault. No memo, no space allocation note, no interoffice directive. Archivists who have studied this in detail have noted the absence. Whatever reasoning existed was never written down, or was written down and did not survive. The schedules were there. The vault was nearby, and the 1890 schedules were not in it. On the evening of January 10, 1921, most Commerce Building employees had already left for the day. Near 5 o'clock, a night watchman named James Foster noticed smoke rising through the elevator shaft. He could not find flames. The smoke seemed to come from somewhere near the furnace room. He reported it. Within minutes, the fire alarm had been activated. The first crews arrived around 5:30 in the evening. The basement was already impenetrable with smoke. Firefighters couldn't get in directly. They punched more than a dozen holes through the first floor, a wooden surface over 6 inches of concrete, and poured water down through the openings into the darkness below. They worked for hours. The total volume of water pumped into that basement during those hours was never formally recorded. One account describes it as producing ankle-deep standing water across the entire floor when it was over. Inside the fireproof vault, the water found the door. Of the 8,919 volumes stored inside, 7,957 volumes from the 1910 census were damaged by flooding. But the vault held. The 1880, 1900, and earlier schedules emerged largely intact. The 1890 census was not inside the vault. If you had stood in that basement on the morning of January 11, 1921, this is what you would have encountered. The smell of cold wet ash and burned paper, not the smell of burned wood, something closer, something more specific, faintly chemical, water standing on concrete, pine shelving collapsed or charred to bare frames. Where the volumes had been stacked, heaps. Some of them fused solid and black, some swollen with water, compressed into masses that had stopped resembling books. Some pages at the edges of the room merely dampened, still legible, still holdable, still there. Census Bureau Director Samuel Rogers assessed the damage. His accounting, roughly 25% of the 1890 schedules had been destroyed outright by fire. Approximately 50% of what remained showed serious damage from water, smoke, and heat. Total damage, somewhere between 75 and 80% of the census. But 20 to 25%, scorched at the edges, waterlogged, fragile, was still there. What followed that morning was 12 years of nothing. The damaged schedules were moved to temporary storage in late January 1921. In May, newly installed Director William Mott Stewart ordered staff to attempt to preserve and organize surviving materials. A small effort was made. A small number of schedules were retained. Rumors moved through genealogical and archival circles that Director Rogers had privately recommended destruction to Congress. The National Genealogical Society filed a formal objection. Other archivists and researchers who understood what individual level 1890 data represented made their concerns known. The internal debate continued through the 20s. The records sat in temporary storage. They were not moved to better conditions. They were not systematically restored. They were not microfilmed, a technology that existed, that was beginning to be used for document preservation in that very era. They sat, continuing to decay at their own pace, through 8 years of the Roaring Twenties, through the opening years of the Great Depression, through the end of 3 presidential administrations, through more than 4,000 days of institutional silence. In December of 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census compiled a routine administrative list of papers no longer necessary for current business. The list was sent to the Librarian of Congress under the standard federal records disposition process. The librarian had authority to designate anything on the list as permanently valuable. Anything designated would be preserved. Item 22 was not designated. On February 21, 1933, Congress authorized destruction. On February 20, 1933, the day before, President Herbert Hoover had laid the cornerstone of the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. The National Archives had been in development since the late 1920s. In direct response to the ongoing problem of federal records being stored in inadequate conditions, the precise vulnerability that had allowed the Commerce Building basement fire to damage a census. The building was designed to be fireproof. Its vaults were designed to prevent exactly the kind of loss that had occurred on January 10, 1921. It would open in 1935. The building designed to prevent the destruction of federal records was receiving its cornerstone the day before Congress authorized the destruction of the federal records that could not wait 2 more years. By 1934, or possibly 1935, the 2 surviving administrative notes from that period are inconsistent on this point. The remaining population schedules of the 1890 U.S. federal census were destroyed by the Department of Commerce. The final destruction was noted in one administrative record as having occurred not approved by the geographer. What a geographer's approval had to do with a destruction authorization, and why that note was made at all, has never been explained. The note survives. The schedules do not. Of 62,979,766 documented Americans, approximately 6,160 names are accessible to researchers today. Fragments from portions of Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, South Dakota, Texas, and the District of Columbia. Incomplete for every single one of those states. In some cases, a few dozen pages from a single county. In others, slightly more. Digitized, catalogued, held today by the National Archives, the institution completed 2 years after the destruction of what it was built to protect. The mainstream explanation for all of this should be stated plainly, because it exists and it is not implausible. The 1921 fire was caused by a foreseeable combination of ordinary failures, a furnace, combustible storage, inadequate separation of materials, standard firefighting. The 1890 schedules may have been stored outside the vault for no reason more deliberate than administrative routine or limited space. The 12-year gap between damage and destruction reflected genuine uncertainty about salvage costs during a period that included a global economic collapse. Item 22 was one of many items on a routine list. The published aggregate data still existed, and a federal official in 1932 had no reason to flag a damaged genealogical record set as a national preservation emergency. All of this is plausible. Most of it is probably accurate. What the mainstream explanation does not address is the specificity of what was lost and which populations lose the most when 1890 disappears. The 1880 census protected in the vault captures the generation just before the peak of Eastern and Southern European immigration. The 1900 census, protected in the vault, finds that same generation after they had settled, married, had children, and established households. The 1890 census, outside the vault, partially burned, left 12 years to decay. Destroyed as item 22 was the only federal record documenting those same people at the precise moment of their arrival and earliest settlement in this country. Their self-reported naturalization timelines, their family compositions in the first years in a new home, the specific decade the immigrant generation first appears by name, living in a specific place. For millions of American families, tracing immigrant ancestry, 1890 is simply the missing year. The ship manifest sometimes exists. The 1900 census exists. What exists between them is 10 years during which families formed. Children were born. Names were spelled inconsistently across county records, if a courthouse fire hadn't erased those too. For African American genealogical research, the weight of the loss concentrates differently. The 1870 census was the first in which formerly enslaved Americans appeared in the general population schedule by name. The 1880 census found that same generation a decade on, with established households, children born in freedom, sometimes property of their own. The 1890 census would have been the third documentation. This generation at the height of their post-war family formation, in the years just before the systematic dismantling of Reconstruction-era rights began. It would have been the first census capturing their adult children, a generation born entirely free, appearing as household heads for the first time. That record was not in the vault. The 20-year gap between 1880 and 1900 falls directly across the most consequential decade in black family formation in the American South. Researchers working on post-emancipation family trees describe meeting that gap repeatedly. A family visible in 1880, visible again in 1900, and the decade between, where property changed hands, where households divided, where migration started, where children were named, accessible only through whatever local records happened to survive in courthouses that across the South burned at rates that were far from coincidental. Archivists who study this have used the term paper wall to describe 1890, not as a metaphor, as a structural feature of the American documentary record. And the shape of that wall, the specific decade it covers, the specific populations it most heavily affects, is not random. If you are tracing a family line across the 1890 decade today, you will meet the same wall every other researcher has met. Not a gradual thinning of records, not a gap that points to a specific local disaster. A clean national stop. Present in 1880. Present in 1900. And in between, item 22 and 12 years of doing nothing, and a cornerstone laid the day before the authorization, and a note that says not approved by the geographer without explaining who the geographer was, or what they thought should happen instead. All the paperwork about the destruction of the paperwork survived. The fire assessments are in the record. The damage reports were filed. The internal memos about salvage exist. The destruction authorization is accessible. Item 22 is a real locatable document, sitting today in the National Archives. The building whose cornerstone was laid the day before Congress said yes to destroying the records that building was meant to protect. The 1890 census does not exist. The documentation of its absence is complete. If your family tree has a wall at 1890, if there's a decade between two names you can't account for, a generation that disappears and reappears with slightly different details, you're not missing something. You're standing at the edge of what item 22 left behind. Leave a comment below if you've hit it, because the shape of that absence is the same for tens of millions of people, and almost no one talks about what it actually means. If this is the kind of record nobody tells you to look for, subscribe, because that's all this channel does. I wasn't looking for any of this.